Hello and welcome to this video on the biconditional. This is section 6.2 truth functions part 2, and in this video I'm going to devote myself just to showing you why the truth values for the biconditional end up being the way they are. And those are all over here on the top right in highlights. So notice that the truth values end up being such that when both P and Q are true, the whole thing is true, and when both P and Q are false, the whole thing is true as well. So it's only when the truth values are different, it's only when P is true and Q is false, and when P is false and Q is true, that the truth values are false. That might be a good way to memorize the whole thing. It's basically if the truth values are the same, then they're true, and if the truth values are different, then they're false. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compute the truth values for the conjunction of two conditionals over here at the bottom. And the reason for that is because remember, P if and only if Q, that is P triple bar Q, is equivalent to if P then Q and if Q then P. Remember, that's what that means. This is something that we learned in section 6.1. Because they're equivalent, then all I have to do is compute these truth values here and show you that whatever we get is what we're going to get over here in the highlights. Okay, so let's start with the first line, or the first row, and this is the case in which both P and Q are true. Let me compute the values on the left conjunct first and then do the right conjunct. So if true then true, that is if P is true and Q is true, then the whole thing is true, right? So let's put T there. The second line here is the case in which P is true and Q is false. Well, remember that's if T then F is F, and that's the case in which the consequent is false. And by the way, I'm using the implication table over here. That's the reason I have it, because that's the table that I need in order to compute the conditional here. Okay, the third line is the case in which P is false and Q is true. And that's basically the third row over here, right? And when that happens, when the antecedent is false, that is the P, and the consequent is true, then the whole thing is true, right? So we would have a T on the third row here. And then finally, the last one is the case in which they're both false. And remember, when they're both false, the whole conditional ends up being true, right? So that's why we would have these values here for the right conjunct. I'm sorry, for the left conjunct. Let's now look at the right conjunct. Okay, so the right conjunct is the case in which we're looking at Q as the antecedent and P as the consequent. Okay, well, the first row is easy because, again, they're both true, so the whole thing ends up being true, right? Okay, the second row is a little bit more tricky. We have the case in which Q is false and P is true, right? Well, that basically is another way of saying that the antecedent is false and the consequent is true. And that would be actually the third row over here, right? Where the antecedent is false and the consequent is true. Well, the whole thing still ends up being true, right? So I would put a T over here. And now we go on to the third row, and that's the case in which in this case the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, right? The P is false. Well, remember, that's the case in which the whole thing is false, right? And that would be the second line over here, right? Where the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. That's the case in which the whole thing is false. Okay, and then our last row is very easy. That's because they're both false, and remember, when both the antecedent and the consequent are false, then the whole thing ends up being true. The whole thing ends up being true. Okay, so that is the reason why we would have these truth values in the right conjunct and the left conjunct. Now we have to do the whole conjunction, because remember, the whole statement here is a complex statement, which is a conjunction of two conditionals where the order of the antecedent and the consequent are reversed. So now we have to do the whole conjunction. Well, for that we have to look at this table over here, the conjunction table, and that's why I have the conjunction table here over here on the left. So let's look at the case in which they're both true. So this would be true and true, because this is a conjunction, right? That would be true. And let me highlight this in red, make this red, because this is our final outcome. Okay, the second row would be the case in which the left conjunct is false and the right conjunct is true, so that would be false and true. Well, remember, the whole thing is false. Remember, if at least one of the conjuncts is false, then the whole thing is false. And that's what we have in the third row as well. We have, in this case, the right conjunct is false and the left conjunct is true. Well, the whole thing is still false. And so that's why that's false. So let's make that red. Okay, and then in the last row, they're both true. And so remember, when both conjuncts are true, the whole thing is true. And that's why that would be true. Okay, so we now have the final outcome, which is all in red. Let me shift it over a little bit to the left. And so that is why you see that under the main operator, which is that conjunction, that dot, the values are TF, FT, which is what we have over here for the biconditional. And that is the reason why these values are the way they are. Okay, thank you for joining me for this video. Keep on watching the videos and